Have you ever helped someone and then asked yourself, did I do the right thing? Well, yes, not every good deed has a happy ending, and this story will prove it to you. An ordinary woman living in New York was facing one of those days when the world seems to want to swallow you up. A boss pressuring you, a family demanding you, and an avalanche of doubts about life. It was then that, in the middle of the hustle and bustle of the city, she saw a man huddled on the sidewalk. A homeless man, dirty, invisible to the eyes of others, but with a look that seemed to scream from within. Without thinking twice, she offered help, compassion, affection, a beautiful, spontaneous human gesture. What she didn't know was that this man carried a dangerous past, a secret buried for more than 20 years. And that by laying out that coat, she wasn't just warming someone up. She was opening the door to a world of conspiracy, betrayal, and revelations that would shake everything she believed about her own family. Sounds like an exaggeration? Wait, because what begins as a story of empathy turns into a mystery involving the FBI, secret documents, and a father who's been missing for decades. Yes, all of that. Did she regret it? Maybe. But not the gesture, but the truths it exposed. This isn't just a story. It's an invitation to rethink what it means to help, to understand that not all kindness comes with an immediate reward, and that sometimes the price of truth is finding out who you really are. Ready? Because after this, you'll never look at someone sitting on the sidewalk the same way again. The city did not forgive those who walked slowly. Everything was noise, honking, rushing, and tiredness. And there she was, another face lost in the crowd, facing one of those days when everything seemed to collapse at the same time. Demands at work, arguments at home, and that cruel doubt about whether or not she was living the right life. The slow traffic was taking her nowhere, but her mind, her mind was already miles ahead, rehearsing answers she would never have the courage to give. When she finally got off the bus, she came across another homeless person huddled on the sidewalk. She could have walked right past, like all the others. But something there, in that look so full of silence and in that hand clutching a torn book with so much affection, made her stop. For a moment, the chaos around her went silent. Without thinking much, she handed over her snack, some coins, and took off her coat, holding it out to him kindly. Not even words were exchanged, but something happened there. Something that both of them felt, even without understanding. That ordinary woman who deep down felt invisible in her own life discovered at that moment the power of an unexplained gesture. It was not about heroism, nor about charity. It was an act of compassion, born of humanity and driven by a type of wisdom that is not learned in books but in shared pain. As she laid out the coat, she felt warm inside, as if she were giving a piece of herself back to the world. Sometimes what saves is not the one who receives, but the one who offers. Because there is something deeply healing in empathy, in that look that sees the other not as a problem, but as a mirror. And it was there, on the corner between chance and inspiration, that a silent connection was born. The kind that makes the soul whisper, "Pay attention. This is going to change." Everything. Back home, she still felt the cold in her body, but her chest was burning. It wasn't a fever. It was the discomfort of someone who had touched something too deep to ignore. Who was that man? Why did the way he held that book seem so meaningful? Her heart was beating with a mixture of curiosity, fear, and a strange sense of trust that made no sense at all. It was as if, without knowing it, she had entered an unknown territory, where everything still seemed normal on the outside, but inside, something was starting to move. That night, for the first time in months, she slept without rolling around in bed. But she didn't sleep peacefully. She dreamed of eyes staring at her in the dark, and of phrases she couldn't remember when she woke up. Because sometimes life doesn't tell you that it's changed chapters. It simply turns the page and leaves us reading in the dark. The next morning, New York City seemed colder than usual. The gray sky covered the hurried movement of people who, as always, looked away from what they didn't want to see. She, however, went straight to the sidewalk, where the day before, she had left a piece of her heart, along with a gesture of compassion. And there he was, sitting in the same position, hugging the same torn book, as if he had spent the entire night protecting it like a reliquary. When he saw her, he looked up and smiled, a short but intense smile, almost mysterious, and then he said in a low, firm voice, "You will remember me." She smiled back, a little disconcerted, thinking it was just another one of those loose phrases that homeless people sometimes say, perhaps the result of some mental disorder. But there was something in that look, a sincerity that hurt, as if he knew something she still couldn't understand. Since that day, something in her has changed, not out of pity, but out of a kind of new understanding, as if that man was hiding more than the city dared to see. So day after day, she began to visit him, first with a cup of Starbucks coffee, then with sandwiches, clean blankets, until their meetings became rituals. They talked little but deeply. He spoke in enigmatic phrases, releasing scattered memories, like pieces of a puzzle without edges. He told her that he had lived in other states, that he had lost someone, that he had run away from things bigger than him. She listened with respect, trying to separate the delirium from the truth, but without rushing. After all, she wasn't looking for answers either. She was looking for inspiration. And there was something true in that broken soul. The most curious thing was the way he spoke about time, as if he had already lived too much, or perhaps as if he was always ahead of everyone else. In one of the conversations, he said something like, "Sometimes we only understand the right choice many years later, or minutes before we die." She laughed, not knowing how to react, but the phrase stuck in her mind, like those songs that play on the radio and never leave. It was hard to explain, but she felt that this man was not ordinary. And this trust, which was slowly emerging, clashed with her reason. After all, he was just a homeless person, right? So why did his presence cause such a commotion? Why deep down did she start to look forward to those conversations? Maybe because sometimes the soul recognizes what logic tries to hide, and when that happens, life never goes straight again. The weeks passed at a strange pace, as if time had decided to move sideways. Visits to the man on the sidewalk became part of her routine, as natural as having her first coffee in the morning or facing the subway line at Union Square. But then, the atmosphere changed. First, there were the small details. Her cell phone would ring without anyone speaking on the other end of the line. Then, emails with no sender would arrive in her inbox, with sentences identical to those the man had said. Days before, exact words, the same punctuation, as if someone was watching from very close. She started losing things at home. First her keys, then a blouse. Even her diary, the one where she wrote her most intimate reflections, disappeared from the bedside table. It was as if the universe was telling her something, but without using its voice. And the most disturbing thing was that no one else seemed to notice. Only she. Only she saw. Instead of retreating, she got even closer. Curiosity, that stubborn spark that often disguises itself as courage, spoke louder than her sense of self-protection. She justified it to herself with phrases like, "He wouldn't do that," or "It must be a coincidence." But deep down, a growing insecurity was entwining her decisions. People around her began to comment that she was acting strangely, distracted, disconnected, absorbed. Her boss warned her about being late. Her sister said she seemed to be living in a parallel reality. But how could she explain to someone that her entire world was being invisibly turned upside down? That every detail of her life now seemed under surveillance, as if there were a script being written in secret, with her as the main character. And yet she kept going, as if she were being guided by something stronger than fear. Maybe empathy. Maybe necessity. One afternoon, when she arrived at the place where he always stayed, she found the man staring at the traffic. When she approached, he murmured, "It's getting too loud, isn't it?" and stared into space again. She froze. It was the same sentence she had received in an email that morning. From that moment on, she could no longer ignore the signs. He knew things that no one else did, and that scared her, but it also intrigued her. Was he following her? Was this all some kind of plan? Doubt gnawed at her, and yet something else kept her there, a strange confidence that grew along with the fear. Because despite everything, the feeling that there was an important piece about to be revealed was irresistible. And little did she know that the first name to emerge from the past would turn the world upside down. That afternoon, the sky was painted in leaden tones, and the wind that cut through the corner of 7th Avenue seemed to announce that something important was about to happen. She reached the spot where he always stood, between a worn yellow fire hydrant and a convenience store window with a neon sign flashing open. She sat down next to him, as if she no longer needed to ask permission. They both remained silent for a few minutes, as usual, until, without warning, he blurted, "I'm your father, Walter. He tried to warn you." Time stopped. Walter. The word fell like a muffled thunder, the name she hadn't heard spoken aloud since childhood, since before the disappearance that shaped her entire life. How did he know that? The shock was so great that she jumped to her feet, but he remained there, motionless, as if he had just recited the weather forecast. "The pieces are falling into place," he said, and for the first time she felt a fear that wasn't just psychological, it was ancestral. In the hours that followed, she was overcome by a whirlwind of memories and questions. Walter had disappeared when she was 8 years old. One day he left for work and never came back. No news, no clues. Her mother died years later, never accepting his disappearance, and since then his name has become a taboo, a kind of family wound that everyone knew was there, but no one dared to poke at. How could that man, supposedly a stranger, have access to such a buried memory? The trust that had begun to sprout turned to dust, but along with the distrust came a new kind of hope. What if that man knew more? What if his silence was, in fact, a map waiting to be read? Driven by this restless doubt, she began to look for old archives, do online searches, go to public libraries, sift through old records of disappearances and forgotten news. The connections began to emerge little by little, like fine threads in a ball of wool that seemed to have no end. Between the man's vague information and the digital archives of old newspapers, a first match emerged. A 1998 article about the disappearance of a federal employee named Walter, who coincidentally had the same last name as hers. Then another match, an old article that mentioned the name of a man under investigation for conspiracy and fraud, with a nickname similar to the one the homeless man used. The clues were there, scattered, disguised, but present. And in the IGUM process, she felt like she wasn't just digging into the man's past, she was unearthing her own story. With her eyes full of understanding and her heart torn between forgiveness and anger, she realized that this journey was much bigger than she thought, and what would come next would challenge everything she thought she knew about her family and herself. Her searches led her to a name buried in old FBI reports, Jonathan W. Cole, a forgotten dossier almost all censored, with missing pages, but enough to cause a stir. The man she had been helping with coffee and blankets, the same one who spoke as if he had lived 3 lives, had been the target of a federal investigation 2 decades earlier. The report mentioned his involvement in money laundering, disappearance of government documents, and a clandestine organization called Black Ribbon, a group that infiltrated large corporations to manipulate political decisions. Amid the digitized, black and white photos, she saw something that made her legs go weak, an old picture of her father. Walter was there, side by side with Jonathan, smiling. The scene would have been almost banal if it weren't now painted with tones of insecurity, betrayal, and mystery. She read the caption 3 times, and each time she read it, her head spun more. All her life, she had sought explanations for her father's disappearance. She thought it was an accident, an escape, even suicide. But now, faced with that image, a new theory began to take shape, one that involved dangerous choices, buried secrets, and perhaps guilt. Her father, always so reserved, was part of something dark. And Jonathan, that soft-spoken man with the tired eyes, was more than he seemed. She found herself questioning her own wisdom. How could she have trusted him? But at the same time, a part of her felt that there were still pieces missing, that not everything was as it seemed. She knew, and she knew with the kind of certainty that comes from instinct, that something there needed to be heard until the end. So even in the face of an avalanche of evidence, she decided she would listen to him one more time. Of course, now everything changed. The empathy was still there, but now it was accompanied by vigilance. She could no longer see him only as someone who needed help. Now he was also a key. A man with a criminal past, yes, but who perhaps carried the missing truth. She spent entire nights connecting data, newspaper clippings, location maps, times of disappearances, suspicious transactions. She used open-source tools like the Wayback Machine, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act files, and even obscure internet discussion forums. With each new clue, she felt more immersed in a story that seemed like a plot from a conspiracy movie. But real life is always crueler, because in it there is no pause to breathe, and at the next turn she would have to decide whether to continue trusting or whether to start protecting herself from the person she thought she was saving. She stopped going. For an entire week she avoided the sidewalk, deviated from her usual route and left her phone on airplane mode. Something inside her, perhaps a primitive instinct for self-preservation, whispered, "Stay away." But her restless mind insisted, what if he's telling the truth? It was a silent war between wounded reason and insistent empathy. Jonathan had revealed too much, dropped an emotional bomb on her hands, and gotten away with it almost unscathed. He said that her father, Walter, was not just an accomplice, he was someone who at the last moment tried to make amends. He also said that he paid the price for it, with his own life. According to Jonathan, he had tried to protect her ever since. But how could she believe? How could she separate real altruism from manipulation? Understanding did not come easily, when trust was already full of cracks. At the end of that week, she sat alone on a bench in Washington Square Park, watching the street musicians and students walking around, each in their own world. She picked up her cell phone and typed in the anonymous email address from which she received messages. Without knowing exactly why, she wrote, "I need to understand." In less than an hour, she received a new note on recycled paper stuck under the bench, like in spy movies. The handwriting was his, and the content was a mix of confession and outburst. He said he was proud to have watched her grow up from afar, that he had never really abandoned her, and that now it was up to her to decide what to do with the truth. It was all very calculated, almost theatrical, and that increased her distrust. But at the same time, it awakened something deeper. Hope, perhaps, or the visceral desire to reconcile with the past. She decided to meet him one last time. She put on an old shirt of her father's as a way of feeling stronger and went to the agreed place, a disused laundromat in Queens. The place was dark, but familiar in its decay. Jonathan was there as always, with his eyes alert and that voice that seemed more like a silent reading than speaking. He told her everything, that Black Ribbon existed, that Walter had tried to leave, that there was evidence scattered around and threats that had not been stopped. He also said that she was still in danger, and that for that reason he needed to disappear, but not before handing over what belonged to her. Hearing everything, she oscillated between anger and compassion, disbelief and wisdom. Was that a goodbye? A trap? A poorly disguised request for forgiveness? She left there more confused than ever. Because sometimes the truth does not set you free, it weighs, and it was precisely this weight that prepared her for the next blow, the cruelest of them all. She thought she had seen it all, that the worst had already been revealed, that the emotional avalanche could not get any more intense. How wrong she was. It started with an email from HR. "We have detected suspicious activity in your system." Then came notifications of attempted logins to her bank accounts, unrecognized transactions, and as if that were not enough, an anonymous complaint that almost made her lose her job. The files on her computer were encrypted, personal documents were missing, and her backup seemed to have been tampered with. She was being invaded, but not only digitally, emotionally, spiritually, because everything pointed to a single source, Jonathan. The same man who swore he had tried to protect her now seemed to be manipulating her from the shadows. It was as if the forgiveness she was beginning to build had been ripped out of the ground with his own hands. And in its place, anger was born. For days, She oscillated between despair and paralysis. She called the cybercrimes department, contacted a friend who worked in digital security, and even hired a freelancer on Upwork to try to track the accesses. The result came in 72 hours. The main IP was linked to a hidden network that could only be accessed with authorization. In other words, it wasn't just anyone. Someone trained, someone experienced, someone like Jonathan. The penny dropped at once. She had been used, and masterfully. Every step she took was induced, every doubt planted with patience. The confidence that had withstood the previous shocks was now crumbling. And with it came a type of loneliness that couldn't be put into words. It wasn't just her against the world. It was her against the past, against her own choices. Remorse throbbed. What if it had all been a plan from the beginning? She cried on the kitchen floor, alone, staring at the frozen screen of her laptop. For the first time, she felt foolish for having believed, for having nurtured hope, for having offered kindness to someone who perhaps had only been hiding behind a well-rehearsed facade. But amidst the chaos, a question rose like a torch. Why? Why would he do this? What would he gain from all this? Was it truly a personal betrayal or part of something bigger, something she had yet to understand? And that doubt, strangely, kept her from breaking it all, because even among the shards of honesty, there was a twinge of unresolved understanding. Something told her the end had not yet come, and indeed, he would still leave one more piece, one last message. And with it, the beginning of an unthinkable turnaround. She returned to the place where it all began, driven by an impulse she couldn't explain. Maybe a last attempt to understand, maybe an unconscious need to end it all in a dignified way. The spot on the sidewalk, between the fire hydrant and the convenience store window, was now empty. No sign of Jonathan. Just the cold wind blowing plastic wrappers and the city lights ignoring yet another absence. But then she saw something. In the pocket of the coat she had donated weeks before, hanging on the back of a park bench, there was a brown envelope. Inside, a note with a few words. "Use this wisely. The truth is yours now." The handwriting was his. The feel of the paper was familiar. And along with the note, a sequence of coordinates, encrypted codes, and the password for a private server. This was no ordinary goodbye. It was the trigger for something much bigger. With the help of Alex, an investigative journalist she had met on a federal crime discussion forum, she began to decipher the data. They spent nights drinking coffee in the kitchen, studying maps, patterns, old documents, and encrypted audio. What they discovered was frightening. The files led to an abandoned warehouse in Jersey City, where they found boxes with cassette tapes, flash drives, and documents signed by high-ranking executives, all involved in a multinational corruption scheme. Money laundering, political manipulation, and even involvement in disappearances like Walter's own. But what hurt the most was finding out that her father had, in fact, tried to report everything and had been silenced for it. Jonathan had kept everything, protected it as best he could, and now he was passing the baton to her. It was shock, forgiveness, anger, and gratitude, all at the same time. She took a deep breath as she handed the documents over to the authorities. Not out of fear, but out of resilience, because she knew that now she was no longer a loose piece. She was an active part of the game. The scandal exploded, names dropped, headlines ran in the newspapers. Justice began to move, albeit slowly. And she, in silence, felt the weight of hope of thousands of people who never knew there was someone willing to break the cycle. But Jonathan's was still missing. The police said he had probably been eliminated, but she knew or wanted to believe that he had fled. Chosen anonymity again. Maybe he was watching from afar. Maybe he was waiting for the right moment to reappear. And even with everything revealed, she felt that the story was not over yet. Because there are silences that scream louder than any scandal. And he still had more to say. Handing over the documents to the authorities was not an act of heroism. It was an act of liberation. She was not looking for medals, headlines, much less the approval of a country. What she wanted deep down was reconciliation, with her, father with her past, with that version of herself that one day offered a coat to a dirty man on the sidewalk without realizing what was beginning. The names of those involved began to be mentioned in news reports. The investigation became public, but the most important thing was to see the photo of Walter, clean and rehabilitated, being mentioned as the key piece of a warning that no one wanted to hear at the time. For the first time, she was able to say her father's name without feeling a lump in her throat. It was moving, yes, but also necessary, because there are pains that can only be healed with truth. Jonathan, however, disappeared as if he had never existed. There were no more records of him anywhere. No concrete clues, just that last letter delivered in an almost poetic way. The police said he had probably been eliminated by people who didn't want to see the dirt revealed. But she knew, in a way that only one can know with the heart, that he had chosen to disappear. It was his style, the wisdom of anonymity. The restless soul who needed to pay for mistakes in his own way. And in some twisted way, there was a strange kind of love there, silent but present. The kind of love that protects without showing itself, that sacrifices itself without asking for credit. That crosses human flaws with an invisible thread of empathy and humility. With everything she had experienced, she understood that life doesn't offer perfect endings, only possible new beginnings. The truth did come, yes, but it came with the weight of knowing too much, of seeing the world with different eyes. And even so, she remained firm, stronger, more sober, more whole. She began to participate in hearings, debates, meetings with other families who had also lost someone to institutional corruption. And even without Jonathan around, she felt his presence, not as a shadow, but as a living reminder that even mistakes can be reinterpreted. Redemption, after all, does not always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with silence, with an invisible presence. And somehow she knew, if one day he were to reappear, she would not need to ask anything else. She would just have to look, and the look would answer everything. Time passed. The city remained the same in its impersonal haste, but she was no longer the woman who walked through the streets with hunched shoulders and a broken heart. Now, her routine included meetings with NGOs, visits to shelters and lectures in public schools on ethics, corruption, and humanity. She became a reference, but not because she became a celebrity, but because she assumed a rare role, that of someone who transforms pain into a bridge. Each gesture of hers carried wisdom. Each word overflowed with understanding. She no longer saw the homeless as distant figures. She saw them through the eyes of someone who had been there, even if not physically, with the eyes of someone who knows that falling can be a curve in the road and not the end of the road. She even began to write about what she experienced. Her book, Fragments of a Silent Truth, became required reading at universities. In it, she recounted everything, from her first act of kindness to her last letter left on a park bench. And the most impactful part was not the investigative content, but the vulnerability with which she told her story, without portraying herself as a heroine, but as someone who simply had the courage not to run away. The book inspired others to look around with more empathy, to listen to the silences, to respect the signs. She always said in interviews, truth is not a destiny, it is a legacy, something that needs to be lived and passed on with honesty. And that was what she did. She planted small seeds of hope, where before there was only concrete and indifference. But there was something that did not change. Every time she crossed a corner and saw someone sitting on the sidewalk with a lost look in her eyes and a blanket around their shoulders, her heart sank. It was not pity. It was affection, memory, and perhaps a question that never left her alone. Could it be him? Because the doubt was no longer about what he did or did not do. The doubt was now deeper, almost spiritual. Who was he, after all? A repentant criminal, an angel in disguise, or simply a man trying to make the world a little less unfair? The answer may never come. But the story, yes, lives on, in the eyes of those who read it, in the hands of those who help, and in the souls who still believe in the power of kindness. Because sometimes the biggest regret is not having helped someone in the wrong. It is realizing too late who that person really was. And now that you've heard everything, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to go on with your life as if nothing had happened, or are you going to start looking around with more understanding? Because this story, as extraordinary as it may seem, carries something that concerns us all, the power of a gesture. The woman in this story didn't have superpowers. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous. She was just someone who chose to stop and look. And that in itself was revolutionary. But what about you? How many times do you pass by someone without even noticing? How many times do you distrust someone before even listening? Life has left us cold, rushed, disconnected from humanity. But, believe me, every day you have the chance to change that. A coffee offered, a non-judgmental listening, a coat forgotten in the back seat. These are the small actions that carry the true power of altruism. Don't wait for a big revelation to change your path. Start with what you have now. So tell me, when was the last time you did something for someone without expecting anything in return? Comment below and share your experience. Let's spread this movement of empathy, wisdom, and transformation. And if you want to continue learning from stories that touch the soul and expand consciousness, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next stories are coming, and they may be even more powerful, maybe even yours.